The telegram arrived at the White House just after dawn on June 6, 1944. The words were coded clipped clinical, heavy casualties. Omaha Beach situation critical. Units pinned at waterline. Advance stalled. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt read the message twice. His hand, already trembling from years of polio and exhaustion, shook harder. Across the Atlantic, thousands of American boys were bleeding into French sand, and the world's most ambitious military operation in history might be collapsing in real time. This was the moment Roosevelt had dreaded for 2 years. D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, was supposed to be the turning point of the war. It had taken 18 months of planning, millions of tons of supplies, and the coordination of over 150,000 soldiers from multiple nations. The entire Allied strategy, the hope of liberating Europe, the promise made to Stalin and Churchill, all of it hinged on a successful landing. And now, as the sun climbed over Washington, the first reports filtering back to the president's desk painted a picture not of triumph, but a catastrophe. Roosevelt sat in his wheelchair in the Oval Office, surrounded by maps and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. His advisors shuffled in and out, their faces tight with worry. General George Marshall stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Secretary of War Henry Stimson paced the room, reading aloud from updated dispatches. Each new message seemed worse than the last. Omaha Beach was a slaughter. Men were drowning under the weight of their own equipment. Tanks were sinking offshore. Landing craft were exploding before they even reached the sand. German machine gun nests, untouched by the pre-invasion bombardment, were cutting down entire platoons in seconds. And the American people had no idea. Roosevelt had gone on national radio the night before, his voice calm and measured, asking the nation to pray. He had not promised victory. He had not guaranteed success. He had simply asked for faith. But now, as the morning dragged on and the casualty estimates climbed, that faith felt fragile. The president knew that within hours, reporters would begin asking questions. Families would demand information. The press would want statements. And Roosevelt would have to decide, tell the truth and risk national panic, or lie and preserve morale. It was not an easy choice. Roosevelt was a master of public communication, a man who had guided America through the Great Depression with nothing but words and willpower. He understood the power of narrative, the weight of tone, the danger of despair. He also understood that wars were not won by speeches alone. Soldiers needed bullets, not optimism, but soldiers also needed a country behind them, a home front that believed in the mission. If the American public lost faith on day one of the invasion, the psychological blow could be as devastating as any military defeat. The first detailed report from Omaha Beach came through around 10 a.m. Washington time. It was written by a junior officer who had survived the initial landing. His words were raw, unfiltered, nothing like the sanitized summaries Roosevelt usually received. "Men are dying faster than we can count them," the officer wrote. "The beach is covered in bodies. We have no cover. We have no support. The Germans have every inch of sand targeted. If we do not get reinforcements in the next 2 hours, this operation will fail." Roosevelt closed his eyes. He had sent those men there. He had approved the invasion date. He had signed off on the strategy, the logistics, the risks, and now they were dying, and there was nothing he could do but wait. The weight of command, the loneliness of leadership, the terrible mathematics of war, all of it pressed down on him like a physical force. He was 62 years old, paralyzed from the waist down, exhausted from years of crisis management, and he was being asked to make another impossible decision. General Marshall broke the silence. "Mr. President, we need to prepare a statement. The press will be briefing in 3 hours. We need to give them something." Roosevelt looked up. "What do we know for certain?" "We know that 5 beaches were hit simultaneously. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. 4 of them are going relatively well. The British and Canadians are moving inland. Utah Beach was lighter than expected. But Omaha is a disaster. We have over 2,000 casualties there already, and the day is not even half over. And the overall operation? Still viable. If we can secure Omaha in the next few hours, the invasion holds. But if we lose that beach, the entire western flank collapses. Eisenhower is on the ground in England, monitoring everything. He has reserves ready, but he cannot deploy them until he knows where they are needed most. Roosevelt nodded slowly. He thought about Eisenhower, the man he had chosen to lead this operation. Eisenhower, who had spent the previous night writing a statement taking full responsibility for the invasion's failure, a statement he hoped he would never have to deliver. Eisenhower, who was now watching the same reports, making the same calculations, carrying the same weight. What are the Germans saying? Roosevelt asked. Stimson flipped through a folder. Their radio broadcasts are claiming total victory. They say the invasion has been repelled, that the beaches are littered with Allied dead, that the Fuhrer's Atlantic Wall has held. They are calling it the greatest offensive triumph of the war. And our intelligence says the Germans are lying. They are surprised, disorganized, and scrambling to move reinforcements to the coast. But they are not wrong about Omaha. That beach is a nightmare. Roosevelt wheeled himself closer to the map on his desk. He studied the coastline of Normandy, the tiny strip of sand marked Omaha, the arrows indicating planned advances, the red X's marking known German positions. It looked so simple on paper, so clean, so logical. But war was never clean. War was chaos and blood, and young men screaming for their mothers as they drowned in 3 feet of water. He thought about the families back home, the mothers who had sent their sons to war, the wives who had kissed their husbands goodbye, the children who had waved at train stations, too young to understand they might never see their fathers again. What would he tell them? How could he explain that the invasion they had been promised, the liberation they had been waiting for, was turning into a bloodbath? But then Roosevelt thought about something else. He thought about the men still on that beach, the men who had not given up, the men who, despite the fire and the death and the terror, were still moving forward, because that was what they had been trained to do. That was what they had been asked to do. And if they could find the courage to keep fighting, then he could find the courage to keep leading. We tell the truth, Roosevelt said quietly, but we tell it carefully. Marshall frowned. Mr. President, we acknowledge the difficulty. We do not hide the cost, but we emphasize the progress. We tell the American people that this is the hardest day, that we expected resistance, that our men are fighting with extraordinary bravery. We do not lie, but we do not panic. We give them context. We give them hope. And we give them a reason to believe that this sacrifice matters. Stimson leaned forward. And if Omaha fails, if the reports get worse, Roosevelt's jaw tightened. Then we tell them that too, but not until we know for certain. Right now, all we know is that men are fighting and dying, and they need us to hold steady. They need us to believe in them. And we will. The room fell silent. The advisors exchanged glances. They knew Roosevelt was right. Panic would help no one. But honesty, delivered with strength, might hold the country together long enough for the soldiers to do their job. At 1 p.m., Roosevelt met with the press. The room was packed with reporters, cameramen, and radio broadcasters. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Everyone knew something big had happened. The question was how big and how bad. Roosevelt wheeled himself to the front of the room. He did not smile. He did not offer pleasantries. He simply began. My fellow Americans, this morning, Allied forces began the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, over 150,000 men from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. Their mission is to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. Their courage is beyond measure. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. I will not mislead you. This operation is dangerous. It is costly, and it is difficult. Our men are facing fierce resistance from a determined enemy. The fighting is intense. Casualties are significant, but our forces are advancing. They are securing critical positions, and they are doing exactly what we asked them to do. A reporter raised his hand. Mr. President, can you confirm reports of heavy losses on Omaha Beach? Roosevelt met the reporter's eyes. I can confirm that Omaha Beach has been the site of the fiercest fighting. Our men there have faced extraordinary challenges. But they have not retreated. They have not surrendered. And as I speak to you now, they are moving forward. It was not a lie. By early afternoon, small groups of soldiers on Omaha Beach had begun to break through the German defenses. Brave officers, many of them wounded, had rallied their men and led desperate charges up the cliffs. Engineers had blown holes in the barbed wire. Destroyers had moved dangerously close to shore to provide covering fire. Slowly, painfully, the tide was turning. But Roosevelt did not know that yet. Not for certain. He was speaking on faith. Faith in the soldiers. Faith in the plan. Faith in the idea that democracy, for all its flaws, was worth fighting for. Another reporter spoke up. "Mr. President, the Germans are claiming victory. They say the invasion has failed." Roosevelt allowed himself a thin smile. The Germans have claimed many things over the past 5 years. They claimed they would conquer Britain. They claimed they would conquer Russia. They have been wrong every time. And they are wrong now. The press conference lasted 30 minutes. Roosevelt answered every question with the same careful balance of honesty and resolve. He did not sugarcoat the danger. He did not promise easy victory. But he also did not waver. He made it clear that the invasion was proceeding, that the Allies were committed, and that there would be no turning back. When it was over, Roosevelt returned to the Oval Office. He was exhausted. His hands ached. His legs, useless as they were, somehow still hurt. But he could not rest. Not yet. He picked up the phone and called Eisenhower's headquarters in England. The connection was poor, crackling with static, but Eisenhower's voice came through. "Mr. President." "General, I just spoke to the press. I told them we are advancing. Tell me I did not lie." There was a pause. Then Eisenhower spoke, his voice rough with fatigue. "You did not lie, Mr. President. Omaha is still a mess, but we are holding. The men are incredible. I have never seen anything like it. They should have broken. They should have run. But they did not. They are still fighting." Roosevelt closed his eyes. "How long until we know for sure?" "Another few hours. Maybe less. But I think we're going to make it. I think we're going to hold." "Thank you, General. Tell the men. Tell them we are proud of them." "I will, sir." Roosevelt hung up the phone. He sat alone in his office, listening to the distant sounds of the White House, the footsteps in the hallway, the murmur of voices, the hum of the city beyond the walls. He thought about the boys on Omaha Beach, the ones who had not made it off a landing craft, the ones who had drowned in the surf, the ones who had been cut down in the first seconds of the assault. He thought about their families, the telegram that would soon arrive, the grief that would follow. And he thought about the ones who were still alive, the ones who had crawled through the sand, who had climbed the cliffs, who had charged into machine gun fire because they believed it mattered, because they believed in something bigger than themselves. That night, Roosevelt addressed the nation again, this time on the radio. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. He spoke not as a commander, but as a father. "My friends, today our sons, our brothers, our husbands have done something extraordinary. They have begun the liberation of Europe. The road ahead will be long. The cost will be high. But we will see it through. We will see it through. Because we must. Because freedom is worth fighting for. Because tyranny must be defeated. And because the men on those beaches, the men who gave everything, deserve nothing less than our total commitment to finishing what they started." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost a whisper. "Tonight, I ask you to pray. Pray for the men still fighting. Pray for the wounded. Pray for the families waiting for news. And pray for the strength to see this through to the end. We will not fail them. We will not abandon them. And we will not stop until the job is done." By the time the broadcast ended, the reports from Omaha Beach had changed. The beach was secure. The German defenses had been breached. The Allied forces were moving inland. The invasion, for all its horror and chaos, had succeeded. Roosevelt sat in his wheelchair, alone in the dim light of the Oval Office. He did not celebrate. He did not feel relief. He simply felt the weight of what had been done and what would still need be done. The war was far from over. More battles would come. More men would die. But today they had held. Today They had not broken. And that, Roosevelt knew, was what leadership looked like in the hardest moments. Not perfect decisions, not brilliant strategy, just a refusal to give up, the refusal to let fear win, the refusal to abandon the men who were doing the dying. Years later, historians would call D-Day the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. They would study the tactics, the logistics, the turning points. They would analyze what went right and what went wrong. But what they often missed was the quiet moment in the Oval Office, the moment when a paralyzed president, exhausted and terrified, chose to tell the truth without breaking the nation's spirit, chose to believe in men he could not see, fighting a battle he could not control, chose to lead not with lies or false promises, but with honesty, resolve, and faith, because that is what true leadership demands. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Not the guarantee of success, but the commitment to try. Not the comfort of certainty, but the courage to act when everything is uncertain. Roosevelt understood that. And on June 6, 1944, when the first reports from Omaha Beach looked like failure, he did not flinch. He did not hide. He did not lie. He simply told the American people what they needed to hear, that the fight was hard, that the cost was real, but that the cause was worth it. And in the end, that was enough. The soldiers on Omaha Beach did not fight because of a speech. They fought because they had no choice, because the man next to them was fighting, because retreat meant death. But the nation that supported them, the families that waited for them, the country that sent them, they held together because the president refused to let them fall apart, because Roosevelt understood that wars are not just won on battlefields. They are won in living rooms and factories and churches, in the hearts of people who must believe that the suffering means something. That is a lesson of June 6, 1944. Not just the bravery of soldiers, but the responsibility of leaders, the duty to tell the truth, even when the truth is terrible, the obligation to inspire hope, even when hope seems impossible, and the courage to stand firm when everything is falling apart. Roosevelt did that, and because he did, the men on Omaha Beach were not forgotten. They were not abandoned. They were honored, supported, and remembered. Their sacrifice was not wasted. It was a foundation of victory. In the weeks that followed, the Allies pushed deeper into France. The hedgerows of Normandy became a grinding, brutal battlefield, but the foothold was never lost. The invasion held. The liberation continued. And by the time Roosevelt died in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, he knew that the decision he made on June 6, the choice to trust the men and tell the truth, had been the right one. Leadership is not about having all the answers. It is about making the hard calls when the answers are unclear. It is about holding steady when the world is shaking. And it is about believing in people, even when the reports say they are failing. Roosevelt believed. And because he did, the world changed. The hours after Roosevelt's first press conference were some of the longest of his presidency. The reports continued to trickle in, each one adding another layer of detail to the nightmare unfolding across the Atlantic. By mid-afternoon Washington time, the full scope of what was happening on Omaha Beach began to crystallize. It was not just bad. It was worse than anyone had anticipated. The pre-invasion bombardment, the aerial strikes meant to soften German defenses, had missed their targets. The bombs had fallen too far inland, leaving the beach fortifications untouched. The naval shelling, conducted in darkness and rough seas, had been equally ineffective. When the first wave of American soldiers hit the beach at 6:30 a.m. French time, they had run straight into a fully operational killing zone. The German 352nd Infantry Division, one of the Wehrmacht's more experienced units, had been positioned along the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. They had spent months preparing for an invasion, constructing reinforced bunkers, laying mines, stringing barbed wire, and zeroing their machine guns on every inch of the beach. They had clear fields of fire. They had elevated positions. And they had been waiting. The American soldiers, many of them seasick from the rough crossing, weighed down with 60 pounds of equipment, had disembarked from their landing craft into chest-deep water. Some had drowned immediately, pulled under by the weight of their packs. Others had made it to the sand, only to be cut down by machine gun fire within seconds. Officers had been targeted first, picked off by snipers before they could organize their men. Radios had been destroyed. Medics had been killed trying to reach the wounded. Entire platoons had been wiped out before they could advance 20 yards. And yet, they kept coming. Wave after wave. More landing craft, more men, more bodies piling up at the waterline. By 9 a.m., the beach was in chaos. Soldiers huddled behind obstacles, too terrified to move forward, too exposed to stay still. Wounded men screamed for help. Engineers tried desperately to clear paths through the minefields. Tanks that had made it ashore sat burning, knocked out by German anti-tank guns. But something else was happening too. Something that would not show up in the initial reports. Something that Roosevelt would not learn about until much later. On that beach, in the middle of that hell, individual acts of courage were beginning to turn the tide. A colonel named George Taylor, standing in the surf under heavy fire, shouted at his men, "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." He led a charge up the bluff. Many of his men were killed, but some made it, and they began attacking the German positions from the flanks. A brigadier general named Norman Cota, one of the highest-ranking officers on the beach, walked calmly to the fire, rallying scattered groups of soldiers, personally leading attacks on bunkers, and organizing a breakthrough that would eventually secure the beach. He would survive the day, though dozens around him did not. Destroyers, seeing the disaster unfolding on the beach, broke protocol and sailed dangerously close to shore, risking running aground, so they could fire directly at the German bunkers. Their shells finally began to hit the fortifications, giving the soldiers below a brief window to advance. And the soldiers, exhausted, terrified, many of them barely out of their teens, found something inside themselves that they did not know existed. They got up. They moved forward. They climbed the cliffs. They threw grenades into bunkers. They fought hand-to-hand with German defenders. They bled and died, but they did not stop. By early evening, Omaha Beach was secure. The cost had been staggering. Nearly 2,500 American casualties on that one beach alone. But the line had held. The invasion continued. The foothold in Europe was established. Roosevelt learned of the full casualty figures late that night. He sat in his private study, reading the updated reports by lamplight. The numbers were brutal, but they were also incomplete. Many men were still listed as missing. Many wounded were still being evacuated. The final count would take days, maybe weeks. He thought about the speech he had given earlier that day. He had told the American people that the men were advancing. He had told them to have faith. And it had been true, but only barely. If a few more things had gone wrong, if a few more officers had been killed, if the destroyers had not moved in close, if the soldiers had broken and run, the entire operation could have collapsed. And then what? What would we have said then? Roosevelt did not allow himself to dwell on that question. There was no value in hypotheticals. The invasion had succeeded. The men had done their job. And now his job was to make sure their sacrifice was not wasted. Over the next several days, Roosevelt carefully managed the flow of information to the public. He worked closely with the War Department and the Office of War Information to craft messages that balanced transparency with morale. Casualty lists were released slowly, giving families time to receive telegrams before names appeared in newspapers. Heroic stories were highlighted, giving the public figures to admire, missions to celebrate, reasons to believe. But Roosevelt also insisted on honesty. When reporters asked tough questions, he did not dodge them. When the public demanded to know the cost, he told them, not all at once, not in overwhelming detail, but truthfully. He understood that the American people could handle bad news. What they could not handle was being lied to. This approach was not universally popular. Some members of his cabinet argued that the public did not need to know the full extent of the casualties. Some military leaders wanted tighter control over the narrative, fearing that too much honesty would damage morale. But Roosevelt overruled them. He believed that democracy required trust, and trust required truth. He also understood something else. He understood that the families of the men who died deserved more than propaganda. They deserved acknowledgement. They deserved to know that their sons and husbands and brothers had not died in vain, that their sacrifice had meaning, that the nation was grateful. So Roosevelt began writing letters, personal letters, handwritten when his strength allowed, to the families of soldiers who had been killed on D-Day. He could not write to all of them. There were too many, but he wrote to as many as he could. And in those letters, he did not offer platitudes. He did not say that their loved ones had died peacefully or without pain. He simply said that they had fought bravely, that their country owed them an unpayable debt, and that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. One letter, written to the mother of a young private killed on Omaha Beach, read, "Dear Mrs. Carter, I write to you with a heart full of sorrow and gratitude. Your son gave his life in the service of a cause greater than any of us. He stood on a beach in France, facing unimaginable danger, and he did not falter. He did what we asked of him, and he did it with courage that will inspire generations to come. I cannot ease your pain. I cannot bring him back. But I can promise you that his sacrifice mattered, that because of him and men like him, the world will be free. You have my deepest sympathy and my eternal thanks." Roosevelt signed the letter himself, his hand trembling with exhaustion. He knew the words were inadequate. He knew that no speech, no letter, no gesture could ever compensate for the loss of a child. But he also knew that silence was worse, that indifference was unforgivable, and that the least he could do, the very least, was to acknowledge the cost. In the weeks that followed D-Day, the war continued its brutal march across Europe. The hedgerows of Normandy became a grinding, inch-by-inch battle. The liberation of Paris, the push into Germany, the Battle of the Bulge. Each victory came with a price. Each mile was paid for in blood. And through it all, Roosevelt held steady. He gave speeches. He met with Churchill and Stalin. He managed the war effort from his wheelchair, his body failing, but his resolve unshaken. But D-Day remained a defining moment. The day when everything could have fallen apart. The day when the first reports looked like disaster. The day when Roosevelt had to decide whether to panic or to lead. He chose to lead, and that choice made all the difference. The lesson of that day, the lesson that Roosevelt embodied, is not about military strategy or political maneuvering. It is about the essence of leadership in crisis. It is about the choice to tell the truth without surrendering to despair. It is about the refusal to abandon people when things go wrong. It is about the courage to believe in others, even when the evidence suggests failure. Roosevelt understood that the men on Omaha Beach were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were individuals with families and dreams and fears. And they deserved a leader who saw them as such. A leader who did not hide from the cost. A leader who did not pretend that war was glorious or easy or clean. A leader who simply stood with them, in word and in spirit, and refused to let them fight alone. That is what Roosevelt did on June 6, 1944. And that is why, 70 years later, we remember D-Day not just as a military victory, but as a testament to the power of leadership, the strength of democracy, and the resilience of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. The soldiers who stormed Omaha Beach did not know if they would succeed. Roosevelt did not know if they would succeed. But they tried anyway. They fought anyway. They believed anyway. And because they did, the world changed. That is the story of D-Day. Not just the story of a battle, but the story of a choice. A choice to move forward in the face of fear. A choice to tell the truth in the face of uncertainty. A choice to lead, even when leadership means carrying the weight of thousands of lives on your shoulders. Roosevelt made that choice. And the men on the beach made theirs. Together, they turned what looked like failure into the beginning of victory. Subscribe now for more stories from history's most defining moments. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below.